Hello everybody, and welcome to your very first AP Environmental Science lesson. Today we are going to be talking about community ecology. So you should have already completed your warm-up, but if you are watching this lesson after our Zoom meeting or you missed the Zoom meeting, basically what we were supposed to do was take a look at this picture and kind of come to a conclusion about what we think is going to happen and why do we think that's going to happen. So I think just based off the knowledge that we have, right? We know that crocodiles are predators. We know that they eat meat, right? And this little bird is sitting right in the mouth of this crocodile here. So we can infer that this crocodile is about to, right, chomp down and get himself some lunch, right? So this would be a predator-prey interaction. So moving on, just to get started, again, this lesson is about community ecology, and this corresponds with the pages 212 to 220 in your textbook. And then after completing this lesson, you should be able to identify species interactions that cause negative effects on one or both species, discuss species interactions that cause neutral or positive effects on both species, and also explain the role of a keystone species. And just a review from biology really quickly, remember, to be considered a species, you have to be able to mate and reproduce fertile offspring with other members of your population, right? So an individual species are organisms that can reproduce and create fertile offspring. So your babies have to be able to have babies in order to be considered a part of the same species. And then multiple species make up a population, and then populations come together to make up communities within ecosystems. So that is just a recall from the ecology that you learn in biology. And since bio is a prereq for this course, that should just be a refresher. So when we talk about community ecology, that's just the study of interactions between species. So how do they interact with one another? And throughout the world, species have something called symbiotic relationships. And this is just the relationship between two species that live in close association with each other. So if you're going to have a symbiotic relationship, chances are you're living in the same environment, the same habitat, right? Because you've got to be close to each other. So negative species interactions will include things like competition, predation, parasitism, and herbivory, and we'll talk about all of those as we move forward. So the first negative interaction that we're talking about is competition, and this is the struggle of individuals to obtain a shared limiting resource, okay? So what that means is that if you are an organism, let's talk about maybe, let's say, a forest ecosystem, okay? And there are squirrels and, let's say, chipmunks. Okay, and both the squirrels and the chipmunks want to eat acorns. Okay, I'm actually not an expert. I don't even know if chipmunks eat acorns, but just stay with me for here. So that means that there's only a certain number of acorns to go around. It could be a lot depending on the ecosystem and depending on the production of the acorns, but it is technically a limited resource. So if you are a squirrel and a chipmunk and you both have to have acorns to live, then you are competing with one another to get those resources. Okay, so that's competition, and that occurs in ecosystems all over the planet. The competitive exclusion principle is the principle stating that two species competing for the same limiting resource cannot coexist. So when two species have the same realized niche, one species will perform better and drive the other to extinction. And a niche, just in case we're not aware, a niche is an organism's role in its population, in its community. So what services does it provide? And it's basically like its job. So when two species again have the same realized niche, or they consume the same resources, they can't coexist happily. Okay, so let's say the squirrels and the chipmunks are competing for the same acorns, and the squirrels just happen to be stronger and they can get those resources more easily. They will eventually drive the chipmunks to extinction. So this is an example. So there was An experiment where 2 paramecium were grown separately, and when that happened, they both achieved large population sizes. So if you're growing a paramecium in the laboratory, they had 2 different populations, they were by themselves, and when that happened, they were both able to experience an exponential population growth, and they were able to reproduce very rapidly. However, when the 2 species were grown together, so in the same area, P. aurelia continued to grow well, while P. caudatum declined to extinction. So this is that competitive exclusion principle, okay? And this experiment demonstrated that 2 species competing for the same limiting resource cannot coexist. So when you're talking about paramecium, or you do an experiment like this with maybe nutrient agar for bacteria, the resources that these 2 paramecium are competing for is whatever food resource that you give them in the laboratory setting. So in this case, the P. aurelia maybe had something that gave it an advantage so that it could consume, and it was the better competitor, so it outconsumed this little guy down here and drove them to extinction. There is something called resource partitioning, and this is when 2 species divide a resource based on differences in their behavior or their morphology. Okay, so when 2 species overlap in their use of a limiting resource, selection favors those individuals of each species whose use of the resource overlaps the least with that of the other species. Over many generations, the 2 species can evolve to reduce their overlap and thereby partition their use of the limiting resource. So this is natural selection at work. Again, referring back to our biology days. So what we see here is selection for individuals who are not competing. Okay, so let's say that we have a bird population that eats the same seeds. Okay. So we've got maybe one type of bird, right, that maybe has a smaller beak and can eat the smaller seeds. And then we've got another bird that has a larger beak and will eat the larger seeds. Now, over time, nature will select for the birds with the smaller beaks that are foraging for the smaller seeds, as well as select for the birds with the larger beaks that are eating the larger seeds. And the reason that this selection is happening is because the birds in the middle, so maybe they have more moderate sized beaks and they're going for the moderate sized seeds, these birds are not selected for because they are competing with one another for the same resource, so they are less likely to thrive, okay? And this again is called resource partitioning. Predation is an interaction in which one animal typically kills and consumes another animal. Okay, so this is again a negative relationship. A parasitoid is a specialized type of predator that lays eggs inside other organisms, and this is referred to as its host. So a parasitoid, an example of that would be like a botfly. I know that botflies will bite humans and lay their eggs inside, and they will kind of just like incubate there and then hatch out of your skin. It's really terrifying. I don't know if you guys have ever seen that show, Monsters Inside Me, but yeah, freaks me out. So to avoid being eaten or harmed by predators, many prey species have evolved certain defenses. So things like toxins or bright colors to kind of serve as a warning. Also camouflage would be a defense to avoid being eaten or harmed. Parasitism is an interaction in which one organism lives on or in another organism. Now, the key difference between predation and parasitism is that in predation, the prey is being killed and eaten. In parasitism, the parasite needs the host to stay alive in order to eat and gain nutrients. An example of this would be a tapeworm, and I actually do have a tapeworm in a jar in my classroom. If we ever make it back there, I will show it to you guys. But you can get tapeworms from like raw food, but a few years ago, it was kind of a trend for fashion models to swallow tapeworms because they will, or tapeworm eggs, because they'll hatch in your intestine and grow in your intestine and kind of like consume the nutrients from the food you eat. So you could kind of like eat and not gain weight because the tapeworm would actually just like consume all the food. It's not healthy, not recommended, really dangerous, but I don't know, it was a thing. And then a pathogen is when a parasite causes a disease in its host. So a single parasite rarely causes the death of its host unless the host is weakened or maybe has like severe deficiencies. In terms of like humans, if humans were to catch a parasite, depending on your vitality, might maybe contribute to whether or not your parasite would kill you or not. Herbivory is an interaction in which an animal consumes a producer. So these are basically your vegetarians, deer consuming grass, consuming foliage, things like that. When herbivores become abundant, they can have dramatic effects on producers. So this is considered to be negative because if there's an overgrowth of consumers that will actually eat producers, then it kind of gets out of control and they eat too many of the producers. And we have to have producers, and we'll learn about kind of energy chains and energy flow a little bit later on in this unit. But producers are very important. And many species of producers have evolved defenses against herbivores. So again, things like toxins. So if you think of like poisonous plants, some mushrooms are poisonous, poison ivy, right? So those are just some defense mechanisms. Other species interactions can cause neutral or positive effects. So not all symbiotic relationships are negative. Mutualism is an interaction between two species that increases the chances of survival for reproduction for both species. So if you are in a mutualistic relationship, both species benefit. And then commensalism is a relationship between species in which one species benefits and the other species is neither harmed nor helped. So one guy is neutral and then the other guy is getting a benefit. And this is just a table that helps you remember the interactions. So in competition, both species are harmed. So there's two negatives here. In predation, one species is helped while one is harmed. Obviously, in the beginning, so our little alligator, crocodile, whatever he was, he definitely would have been benefited because he was eating the bird and he was getting lunch. And then, of course, the bird has a negative effect because the bird's dead. So that's not fun. And then parasitism. Again, we have one species benefited, the parasite, and then the host is negatively affected. Oftentimes it'll be drained of nutrients and energy, but it won't necessarily be killed. So a lot of that is dependent upon the vitality of the host. Herbivory, we've got one species that benefits, and then the species being negatively affected here is the producer itself. So grass, plants, any kind of producer. Mutualism, both species benefit. And an example of mutualism, there is a type of shark, it's either a shark or a whale, where these little fish will kind of swim up to it and eat the barnacles off of it and kind of help clean it. And that's a mutualistic relationship because the fish get food because they're eating things off the shark, and then the shark gets cleaned, and so it's less likely to get infection and get sick. So that's a mutualistic relationship. That's an example of mutualism. And then commensalism, one species gains a benefit and then one species is not affected. So it's neither benefited or harmed, right? So this chart can help you if you're ever given an example and asked what type of species interaction is this. This can be a guide for that. The last thing we're going to talk about is a keystone species. We will talk more about keystone species in Unit 2 as well. But a keystone species is a species that is not abundant but can still have very large effects on a community. So their numbers in their populations are low, but typically they'll do something. They'll have a niche that is very specific, and it is the only organism that can perform that job or function. It's not abundant, but it has large effects on ecological communities. And an ecosystem engineer is a keystone species that creates or maintains habitat for other species. So they will build habitats where other species can live. So that is it for your lesson 1. If you guys have any questions, make sure to reach out and let me know. We will dive deeper into exploring examples of these community relationships in your independent practice for the day.